Hey everybody, this is chapter 6 of Animal Farm. All that year the animals worked like slaves, but they were happy in their work. They grudged no effort of sacrifice, well aware that everything they did was for the benefit of themselves and those their kind who would come up after them, and not for a pack of idle thieving human beings. Throughout the spring and summer they worked a 60-hour week, and in August Napoleon announced that there would be work on Sunday afternoons as well. This work was strictly voluntary, but any animal who absented himself from it would have rations reduced by half. Even so, it was found necessary to leave certain tasks undone. The harvest was a little less successful than in previous years, and 2 fields which would have been sown with roots in the early summer were not sown because of the plowing that had not been completed early enough. It was possible to foresee that coming winter would be a hard one. The windmill presented unexpected difficulties. There was a good quarry of limestone on the farm, and plenty of sand and cement that had found in one of the outhouses, so that all the materials were building at hand. But the problem the animals could not at first solve was how to break up the stone into pieces or suitable size. They seemed no way of doing this except with the picks and crowbars, which no animal could use, because no animal could stand on its own hind legs. Only after weeks of vain effort did the right idea occur to somebody, namely, to utilize the force of gravity. Huge boulders, far too big to be used as they were lying all over the bed of the quarry. The animals lashed ropes around these, and then, all together, cows, horses, sheep, any kind that would lay hold of the rope, even the pigs sometimes joined in at critical moments. They dragged them with desperate slowness up the slope to the top of the quarry, where they were toppled over the edge to shatter the pieces below. Transporting the stone when it was once broken was comparatively simple. The horses carried it off in cartloads, and the sheep dragged single blocks. Even Merle and Benjamin yoked themselves into an old governess cart that they did their share. By late summer, a sufficient store of stone had accumulated, and then the building began, under the superintendence of the pigs. But it was a slow, laborious process. Frequently, it took a whole day of exhausting effort to drag a single boulder to the top of the quarry, and sometimes, when it was pushed over the edge, it failed to break. Nothing could have been achieved without Boxer, though, whose strength seemed equal to that of all the rest of the animals put together. When the boulder began to slip, the animals cried out in despair at finding themselves dragged down the hill. But it was always Boxer who strained himself against the rope and brought the boulder to a stop. To see him toiling up the slope inch by inch, his breath coming fast, the tips of his hooves clawing at the ground, and the great sides matted with sweat, filled everyone with admiration. Clover warned him sometimes to be careful not to overstrain himself, but Boxer would never listen to her. His 2 slogans, "I will work harder," and "Napoleon is always right," seemed to him to be a sufficient answer to all problems. He had made arrangements with the cockerel to call him 3/4 of an hour earlier in the morning instead of a half an hour. And in the spare moments, of which there were not many nowadays, he would go alone to the quarry, collect a load of broken stone, and drag it down to the site to the windmill unassisted. The animals were not badly off throughout that summer, in spite of the hardness of their work. If they had no more food than they had in Jones's day, at least they did not have less either. The advantage of only having to feed themselves and not having to support 5 extravagant human beings as well was so great that it would have taken a lot of failures to outweigh it. And in many ways, the animal method of doing things was more efficient and saved labor. Such jobs as weeding, for instance, would be done with a thoroughness impossible to human beings. And again, since no animal now stole, it was unnecessary to fence off pasture from arable land, which saved a lot of labor on the upkeep of hedges and gates. But nevertheless, as the summer wore on, various unforeseen shortages began to make themselves felt. There was a need of paraffin oil, nails, string, dog biscuits, and irons of the horses' shoes, none of which could be produced on the farm. Later, there would also be a need for seeds and artificial manures, besides various tools, and finally the machinery of the windmill. How these were to be procured, no one was able to imagine. And then one Sunday morning, when the animals assembled to receive their orders, Napoleon announced that he had decided upon a new policy. From now onward, Animal Farm would engage in trade with the neighboring farms. and of course for any commercial purposes, but simply in order to obtain certain materials which were urgently necessary. The needs of the windmill must override anything else, he said. He was therefore making arrangements to sell a stack of hay and part with the current year's wheat crop. And later on, if more money were needed, it would have to be made by the sale of eggs, for which there was always a market in Willingdon. The hens, said Napoleon, would welcome the sacrifice as their own special contribution towards the building of the windmill. Once again, the animals were conscious of vague uneasiness. Never to have any dealings with human beings, they were supposed to never engage in trade, never make any use of money. This had not been among one of the earliest resolutions passed at the first triumphant meeting after Jones was expelled. Hadn't it? I know they discussed it, they thought. All the animals remembered passing such resolutions, or at least they thought they had remembered it. The 4 young pigs who had protested when Napoleon abolished the meetings raised their voices timidly, but they were promptly silenced by a tremendous growling from the dogs. And then, as usual, the sheep broke into 4 legs good, 2 legs bad, and the momentary awkwardness was smoothed over. Finally, Napoleon raised his trotter for silence and announced that he had already made all the arrangements. There would be no need for any animal to come in contact with human beings, which would clearly be the most undesirable part of this. He intended to take the whole burden upon his own shoulders. Mr. Whymper, a solicitor living in Willingdon, had agreed to act as the intermediary between Animal Farm and the outside world, and would visit the farm every Monday morning to receive the instructions. Napoleon ended his speech with his usual cry of, "Long live Animal Farm!" And after the singing of Beasts of England, the animals were dismissed. Afterwards, Squealer made a round of the farm and set the animals' minds at rest. He assured them that the resolution against engaging in trade and using money had never been passed or even suggested. It was pure imagination, probably traceable to the beginning of the ties circulated by all the lies that were circulated by Snowball. A few animals still felt faintly doubtful, though, but Squealer asked them shrewdly, "Are you certain that this is not something that you have dreamed about, comrades? Have you any record of such a resolution? Isn't written down anywhere?" And since it was certainly true that nothing of the kind ever did exist in writing, the animals were satisfied that they had just simply been mistaken. Every Monday, Mr. Whymper visited the farm that had been arranged. He was a sly-looking little man with side whiskers, a solicitor in a very small way of business, but sharp enough to have realized earlier that anyone else, the Animal Farm would need a broker, and the commissions would be worth having. The animals watched his coming and going with a kind of dread and avoided him as much as possible. But nevertheless, the sight of Napoleon on all 4 delivering orders to Whymper, who stood on 2 legs, roused their pride and partly reconciled them to this new arrangement. Their relations with the human race were now not quite the same as they were before, because the human beings did not hate Animal Farm any less now than because it was prospering. Indeed, they hated it now more than ever. The human beings, every human being held in its article of faith that farm would go bankrupt sooner or later, and above all, they all figured that the windmill would be a failure. They would meet in the public houses, and the humans would prove to one another by means of diagrams that the windmill was bound to fall down, or that it did not stand up. Even if it did stand up, the windmill would never work. And yet, against the humans' will, they developed a certain respect for the efficiency for which the animals were managing their own affairs. One symptom of this was that they began to call Animal Farm by its proper name, and they stopped to pretend that it was called the Manor Farm. They had dropped their championship of Jones, all the humans did, who had given up hope on getting his farm back, and gone to live in another part of the country. Except through Whymper, there was yet no contact between Animal Farm and the outside world. But there were constant rumors that Napoleon was about to enter into a definite business agreement between either Mr. Pickington of Foxwood or Mr. Frederick of Pinchfield. But never, it was noticed, with both simultaneously. It was about this time that the pigs suddenly moved into the farmhouse and took up the residence there. Again, the animals seemed to remember that a resolution against this had been passed in the early days, and again Squealer was able to convince them that this was not the case. It was absolutely necessary, he said, that the pigs, who were the brains of the farm, should have a quiet place to work in. It was also more suited to the dignity of the leader, for of late he had been taken to speaking of Napoleon under the title leader, to live in a house rather than a mere sty. Nevertheless, some of the animals were disturbed when they heard that the pigs not only took their meals in the kitchen now and used the drawing room as a recreation room, but they also began to sleep in the human beds. Boxer bested off as usual with, "Napoleon is always right." But Clover, who said she remembered a definite ruling against sleeping in the houses or sleeping in their beds, went to the barn and tried to puzzle out the 7 commandments, which were still inscribed there. Finding herself unable to read more than the individual letters, she fetched Muriel. "Muriel, read me the 4th commandment. Does it say something about never sleeping in a human's bed?" With some difficulty, Muriel spelled it out. "It says no animal shall sleep in beds with sheets," she answered finally. Curiously enough, Clover had not remembered that the 4th commandment mentioned sheets, but there was on the wall just so anyone could see it, so therefore it must have been done. And Squealer, who happened to be passing at this moment, attended by the 2 or 3 dogs, was able to put the whole matter into proper perspective. "Oh, you have heard then, comrades, that we pigs now sleep in the beds of the farmhouse. And why shouldn't we? You did not suppose, surely, that there was ever a ruling against beds, did you? A bed merely means a place to sleep in. A pile of straw in a stall is a bed, properly regarded. The rule was against sheets, which are human inventions. We have removed all sheets from the farm beds and sleep between blankets. And very comfortable beds they are, too, but not more comfortable than we need, of course. I can tell you, comrades, with all the brainwork we have nowadays, you would not rob us of our repose. Would you, comrades? You're not going to take this away from us. We've worked too hard for all of you. You should not have us too tired to carry out our duties, would you? Surely none of you wishes for Jones to come back." The animals reassured him on another point immediately, and no more was said about the pigs sleeping in the farmhouse. And when, some days afterwards, it was announced that from now on the pigs would get up an hour later in the morning than the other animals, no complaint was made about that either. By the autumn, the animals were tired, but they were happy. They had a hard year, and after the sale of part of the hay and corn, the stores of the suit for the winter were none too plentiful, but the windmill compensated for everything. It was almost half built now, and after the harvest there was a stretch of clear, dry weather, and the animals toiled harder than ever, thinking it well worth their while to prod to and fro all day with blocks of stone, if by doing so that they could raise the walls another foot. Boxer would even come out at night and work for an hour or 2 on his own by the night of the harvest moon. In their spare moments, the animals would walk around and around the half-finished mill, admiring the strength and perpendicularly of its walls, and marveling that they should have been able to build anything that would ever be able to build anything so imposing. Only old Benjamin refused to grow enthusiastic about that windmill, though as usual he would utter nothing beyond the cryptic remark that donkeys live a long life. November came, with raging southwest winds. Building had to stop because it was now too wet to mix the cement. And finally there came a night when the gale was so violent that the farm building rocked on their foundation and several towers were blown off the roof of the barn. The hens woke up squawking in the terror because they had all dreamed simultaneously of hearing a gun go off in the distance. In the morning, the animals came out to their stalls to find the flagstaff had been flown down with an elm tree at the foot of the orchard, and that had been plucked up like a radish. They just noticed this when a cry of despair broke from every animal's throats. A terrible sight had met their eyes, because the windmill was in ruins. With one accord, they dashed down to the spot. Napoleon, who seldom moved out of a walk, raced ahead of them. Yes, there the windmill lay, the fruit of all their struggles. It was leveled now to its foundation. The stones they had broken and carried so laboriously were scattered all around. Unable to first speak, they stood gazing mournfully at the litter of all their fallen stone and work. Napoleon paced to and fro in silence, occasionally snuffing at the ground. His tail had grown rigid and twitched sharply from side to side. It was a sign of intense mental activity. Suddenly he halted as though his mind were made up. Comrades, do you know who is responsible for this? Do you know who the enemy who has come in the night and overthrown our windmill? Snowball! He suddenly roared in a voice of thunder. Snowball has done this, in sheer malignity, thinking to set back our plans and avenge himself for this ignominious expulsion. This traitor has crept here under cover of night and destroyed our work for nearly a year. Comrades, here and now I pronounce the death sentence on Snowball, animal hero second class, and a half a bushels of apple to any animal who can bring justice and kill Snowball for us. A full bushel to anyone who captures him alive. The animals were shocked beyond measure to learn that even Snowball could be guilty of something so atrocious. There was a cry of indignation, and everyone began thinking out ways of catching Snowball if he would ever come back. Almost immediately, the footprints of a pig were discovered in the grass at a distance beyond the knoll. They could only be traced for a few yards, but appeared to lead to a hole in the hedge. Napoleon snuffed deeply at them and pronounced them to be Snowball's footprints. He gave his opinion that Snowball had probably come from the direction of Foxwood Farms. No more delays, cried Napoleon when the footprints had been examined. There is work to be done. This very morning will we begin rebuilding the windmill, and we will build all the winter through winter rain or shine. We will teach this miserable traitor that he cannot undo our work so easily. Remember, comrades, there must be no alteration in our plans. They shall be carried out to the day. Forward, comrades! Long live the windmill! Long live Animal Farm! And folks, that's that for today. I want you guys to think how Napoleon is able to manipulate these guys so easily. And I will be discussing this in our discussion questions. Take care, everybody.